So the autofocus modes will help you focus on your subject whether it's still or moving. The autofocus points will help you focus on the right thing in the frame. The camera is analysing the scene in front of it via focus points, which you may be able to see through the viewfinder, or they may just show up when you half press the button. But the camera is looking at the scene and is looking for something to focus on. And the default is that it will focus on what's closest to it, the nearest focus point. And when it's got something to focus on, it will light up a red square, maybe more than one, or green brackets, or however it shows you that it's got the thing in focus. Here are some examples where we've half pressed the shutter button and the camera is telling us it's found something to focus on. So in the top picture the camera's got face recognition and it's focused on the woman, so that's fine. In the picture on the left, the subject is in the middle of the frame and the red AF point has lit up to show us that it's focused on her, so again that's fine. In the bottom picture the camera uses green brackets to show us what it's focused on, and it's focused on the ball. Now the children, ideally we'd like the camera to focus on the children and not the ball. They're close enough to the ball that it may not be a problem. But this may be a time where the autofocus doesn't work very well for us, and the children may not be as pin sharp as we would like. Of course, if you have a touch screen that you can use to focus, then your life becomes much easier. So certainly phones and some compacts and CSCs, you can simply touch the subject and the camera will focus on that, which is too easy really. If you have live view in a DSLR, then you may well have to set the focus point manually. The camera will be focusing on what it focused on last, which will be the centre to start with, and if you move it using the multi-selector, then for the next picture it may well stay in that point, so you'll have to move it back if the subject has changed position. In this picture you can see the red focus point has lit up on the girl and she's closest to us, so that's not surprising. But if we wanted to focus on the man, we'd have to do something different. We couldn't get him in focus using the way the AF points are currently set. Another example where the camera's focused on what's closest, which is this line of contrast in the water, and it's not what we want. We want it to focus on something further away. And because the camera doesn't always get it right, we can choose where it focuses, the autofocus point that it focuses on. There are of course different ways of doing this for different cameras. Canon have this symbol here. Nikon sometimes have switches that you turn. For Canon this is called AF point selection, and many other cameras call this AF point, autofocus point, but Nikon call this AF area mode. And the switch on a Nikon may be on the front. Be aware that you can't change the focus point if you're in continuous focus mode, which is for focusing on a moving subject. This is because in continuous focus mode the camera is choosing what to focus on. It's looking for a moving subject and it's going to focus on that, so the points don't really apply. So once you've found the button or the switch that changes the autofocus point, then you'll probably use the arrow keys or perhaps a dial or a joystick if you've got one to change the autofocus point, to move through the points, and so you can set the one you want. Now I have mine permanently set to the middle focus point and I'll tell you why. The options that you have then with autofocus are just to use the default until you find you have a problem. I'm a great believer in if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if you haven't been aware of this as a problem, then don't worry about it, because if you change from the default, then you will have to remember to do something different each time you focus. If you have noticed that there's a problem and you do want to change the camera, there are two ways of doing this. Some high-end cameras allow you to change the active autofocus point very quickly. You may be able to set up a shortcut button or joystick or something to do this really quickly. So for every picture that you take, you're going to change the autofocus point very quickly to line up with the subject. Now my camera doesn't do that, and what I do, and what many people do, is to set the autofocus point to the centre, so it's always in the middle of the frame. Now of course my subject won't always be in the middle of the frame, especially if I'm using the rule of thirds. So what I do is to lock the focus and reframe, and I'll go through that in a minute. So here's an example where my subject is out of focus, and because I've chosen to have just one central focus point always active, if I just press the button, my subject's going to be out of focus, so I need to do something different. With my autofocus point permanently set to the centre, what I'm going to do is pre-focus on my subject. So I'm going to move the camera so the subject is in the middle. So I'll get the subject in focus and I'll half press the shutter button. This locks the focus to the subject. And now, with the focus locked and holding down the shutter button half pressed, I move the camera to frame the picture that I want, and then I complete the press to take the picture. So this is how it works. I focus on the subject and I half press the shutter, and that locks the focus to the subject. So I hold the shutter half pressed and I change the camera so that I've now got the picture that I want. I now complete the shutter press and the focus has stayed locked to the subject, but she's no longer in the middle and I've got the picture as I want it. So to summarise the autofocus options we've looked at, there are two controls that really you need to know about. The autofocus modes for when you've got a still or a moving subject, and the autofocus points, which is how you tell the camera what to focus on in the frame.